So how to deal with an aggressive teenager addicted to video games, right? So this is a good one, right? Hey, hi, Dr. K. I need advice on what to do with my younger brother, 17. He is autistic, but attends regular school with a decent performance. He didn't get any special education, but we made efforts to be understanding for his difficulties. Before the pandemic, he was socially inept, but still had a good relationship with us. With the start of the pandemic, he got a phone and became addicted to video games, and his behavior changed. He locks himself in his room all day, barely eats, yells loudly for hours on end while playing PvP games. He also uses very foul language and often punches or throws objects violently. His shouting doesn't stop at night and doesn't allow anyone to sleep. Parents and 4 siblings. When confronted about his behavior, even by a simple knock on the door to remind him to lower his voice, he goes into fits of rage and blames it all on us, saying we should leave him alone until he calms down, which sometimes takes hours to days, which is an inconvenience. Last year, he ran away from home, and sometimes he threatens to do it again. And when he puts down his video games, he becomes a little more open to discussion and promises to change and says he understands the problem. However, a few minutes later, he goes back to video games and forgets all of that, and all the shouting, cursing, disrespectful speech resumes. My father gave up on him and doesn't want to take him to a mental health professional. I am an unemployed college student, so I can't do that myself. How should I talk to my brother? Should I ask for outside help? P.S. I'd be overjoyed if Dr. K saw this. I saw it, but but if he didn't, would appreciate any advice. I think y'all should check out the advice in the thread as well. Thank you to Dr. K and thank you to the wonderful community. So this is a hard one. So we get a lot of posts about people asking, what can I do in this situation? And sometimes, for parents and stuff, I think that there's a lot more that they can do. But a lot of the posts that we get are from like siblings who are like, hey, my younger brother or sister or whatever has a problem. What can I do to support them? We also get a lot of posts from people like asking about friends, right? They'll say, oh, my friend is struggling with depression. Like, what can I do? What can I do? My friend or partner is suicidal. Like, I don't know how to support them. We get a lot of requests for people asking, what can I do in situations where they're not really empowered to do much. So the first thing that you've got to do if you're in a situation like this is, first of all, recognize like what you're empowered to do and what you're not empowered to do. And this in and of itself is like oftentimes a place that people get tripped up because they want to do so much, right? Your desires, you care about your brother, you really want to try hard. Like the amount of energy or will that you have to help him is actually potentially outweighed by what you're actually capable of. And we see this a lot in medicine, right? So sometimes, you'll see this, like I tend to think about things like cancer, where, people are willing to do everything within their power. They're willing to take any medicine. They're willing to do this. They're willing to do that. You have lots of doctors that are, willing to go above and beyond to try to save this patient's life. And at the end of the day, you just may not be able to. So you can want something a lot, especially as a sibling. You can care about your brother, you can love your brother, but one of the first things that it's difficult to do is to accept that you cannot fix this problem. You can try to help him by all means, but you have to start out of the gate recognizing that, there's only so much you can do as an older sibling who's unemployed and in college, and that's your karma. That's not really up to you, right? You can't magically be their parent. Some siblings will try, right? So some siblings will get parentified once their parents check out and they become responsible for younger siblings. So ultimately the first thing, and this is where we also it comes back to dharma and karma. So what's your dharma? What's your duty in this situation? And what's your karma? What are you actually capable of? What's your circumstance? So I know it's kind of hard, but the first thing you've got to really do is think through those things. Like, what is your what is the responsibility of an older sibling to a younger sibling? What's the responsibility of a 22-year-old to a 17-year-old? First thing to think about. And furthermore, what are you capable of? Because you're gonna beat yourself up and you're gonna feel ashamed of yourself, and it's gonna be so terrible, because you love your brother so much and you want to do so much for him, but if you're not able to, you're gonna just tear yourself apart internally and you're gonna blame yourself, which is not gonna help anyone. So that's the first thing, is to recognize, basically, I'm going to assume that you have essentially no real power in this situation. Like, for example, as his older sibling, you can't take away his video games, right? Like, I'm assuming you can't do that. You may not understand health insurance or whatever. I don't know what country you're in, but you may not be able to take him to because he's a minor, so he's 17. So you may not be able to take him to a medical doctor or a therapist because you're not his guardian, right? So there are a lot of things that you can't do, which it sounds like your brother needs. So let's get on to that. So the first thing is, I'm so sorry that your dad seems to have mentally checked out and is unwilling to take him to see a therapist, because I think essentially what needs to happen in this situation is that your parents need to take responsibility. And furthermore, it's not their fault, but like, they're probably not equipped to deal with something like this. So this is where, sometimes we'll say, hey, like, you guys should sign up for coaching. Coaching can help with this. When it comes to something like this, and even within our parent coaching, we have this issue. Or when it comes to the intersection of autism spectrum and addiction, especially video game addiction, I really think that having a real mental health professional involved is like really what you need. So remember that autism spectrum has such a constellation of symptoms. So we do see things like emotions that get out of control very quickly. We do see less control over addictive behaviors. We see meltdowns, behavioral disturbances, things like that. There are also different kinds of communication problems. So, in the worst cases, we have people on the autism spectrum that are nonverbal and really don't communicate at all. Then we have people on high functioning autism that can go to school and things like that and have conversations, but their internal ability to become aware of their actions and behaviors may be pretty low. So they'll make promises, but as soon as the game turns on, everything goes out the window. They're not capable of remembering the promise that they made. Their mind can't remind them, hey, remember we promised this thing. So this is where working with a professional is so important, because ideally the professional will understand and map out for the family what the child can and can't handle. And then ideally what you need to do is set up a very strict boundary plan around gaming usage, right? And what I'm sort of hearing in this situation is that there are essentially no boundaries being set on the child, because the child really flips out. And so since everyone is walking on eggshells around the child, you're propagating a lot of bad behavior that is getting worse and worse, and no one is putting a check on the bad behavior, so it's just going to grow out of proportion, right? It's kind of like, if I have an ant mound in my front yard and I don't do anything to stop the ants, the ant mound will keep growing. It'll be an infestation. If I've got termites in my house and I don't do anything to stop them, it'll just keep growing. So behaviors will continue to grow or be shaped by the video games until someone sets some kind of limit. And this is where promises, extracting a promise from someone, is not setting a limit. So setting a limit is about having some kind of behavioral consequence when a certain kind of behavior happens. Extracting a promise is insufficient. So this is what we see, back when I worked in an addiction rehab, I'd have some patients who made lots of promises for many years. They're like, yeah, I promise I'll quit drinking. My last drink, I swear, I'll never do it again. Promise after promise after promise. For year after year after year. And they're not lying. They're very genuine in that moment, right? They really do believe it. They're remorseful. Month goes by, 3 months go by, 6 months go by. And then kind of just sort of forget, right? It's like making a New Year's resolution. The day that you make a New Year's resolution, I'm going to cut out soda for 2022, GG, no more soda. You really mean it. There's a lot of motivation there, right? Just over time, the mind is kind of tricky. It sort of forgets. It kind of, a little bit. Every once in a while is okay. It doesn't matter. I'm eating cookies anyway. So what's the difference between cookies and soda? If I'm going to eat some sugar, sometimes I just enjoy a soda more than a cookie. There are all kinds of rationalizations that, mind gets distracted. You go back to the behavior. So why do people show up at rehab? Because their partner's like, I'm going to divorce you. I'm done with this. Either you go to rehab or I'm done. So 30% of people that have been, rough estimate, okay, I don't have real data on this, but I want to say that 30% of people that I took care of, or patients at rehabs that I've worked at, were undergoing a divorce or separation. So there has to be a consequence in order to drive the behavior. And the problem is, if you're 22 years old and you've got a 17-year-old, I don't know that you can drive that consequence. And if your parents are mentally checked out, I think you guys, it's a really hard uphill battle. I don't think you're going to be able to fix it on your own, bluntly. So I mean, this is what we do in parent coaching is we'll help parents work with their children with autism and set limits. And even then, especially in the cases of autism, we also recommend real mental health, professional mental health help, specifically because when it comes to autism, it's such a heterogeneous manifestation that there isn't like a playbook for autism. If any of y'all have autism or you have a family member with autism, you understand that there's no playbook for autism. Autism in and of itself has so many different presentations. And so setting up the right kind of behavioral plan for someone with autism requires you understanding where their deficits are and where their strengths are, right? And so, for example, just one simple example is like, generally speaking, people with autism do better with concrete communication. So like setting very firm limits that are like super concrete. It's not like get good grades. Like that's too abstract. So you have to be like, you have to study for a minimum of 2 hours a day and get scores higher than 90. And if you don't do that, we will reduce your gaming time by this amount. So it needs to become like a very strict kind of behavioral plan. And I think this is where, I hate to say it, chat, but sometimes we do help your parents set better limits on you, which I think is something that y'all appreciate over time. So that we've heard on stream as well from guests. We've heard, like burnt out gifted kids say, yeah, I wish my parents, were stricter on me. Like I wish they forced me to study when I was a kid so that I knew how to study as an adult. So sometimes we really encourage hard limit setting. And so when it comes to autism, I think as a 22-year-old, I just don't know how much you're capable of, because if you guys have decided that you're not going to seek mental health help and your dad is basically mentally checked out and you guys aren't going to set limits on the kid, I don't know what you can do as a 22-year-old. You can ask him. You can say, hey, like, what do you think about your gaming? It's disruptive for me. But I think getting him to a therapist and maybe talking to your parents about like, hey, I'm worried, like maybe the best thing you can do is talk to your parents and say, hey, I'm worried about my brother. Like, I think this is getting worse. What do y'all think? And then your parents are going to say like, yeah, it's getting worse, but we don't know what to do. And that's when you can say, okay, so if you don't know what to do, I don't know what to do either. Generally speaking, when you don't know what to do, maybe we should go consult a professional because it's their job to know what to do. Right? I don't think that he's like ill or anything, and it's not like you guys are doing a bad job, but it just feels to me like we're outgunned in this situation. So maybe we need to get a little bit of help. And I think if you can really win over your parents and get them to a professional, that'll be like the first step.